Today, I am here with the one and only Dr. Molly Parker. I've been trying to get Molly on this podcast for a while, and we finally worked out in our schedules, and she is just a knowledge ball. I don't know what to say. I was going to say like knowledge bomb, but I don't know.
I like ball.
She's a ball of knowledge.
I love that.
And this is going to be great. So you guys are in for a treat. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad we finally get to do this.
Yes, me too. So do you want to introduce a little bit about yourself and who you are?
Yeah, so my name is Molly Parker. I'm a physical therapist by trade, and I got into concussions kind of accidentally. In 2011, I had, my dream job. I was in this, small little orthopedic clinic that I loved, and I was hit by a cab driver who fell asleep at the wheel. And at the time, concussions weren't really talked about. So I just thought it was one of those things that went away. It didn't. And back then, nobody knew it was happening. So I just got progressively worse and worse and worse. I mean, really for years until I was completely debilitated. And it was kind of this moment where it was like the information just wasn't out there. And I had to do all the research on my own. And eventually I did, claw my way out significantly. I still have symptoms to this day, but many of them developed later on, particularly the ones I deal with now. And so when I was at my worst, I would just lay there and think of like, this shouldn't be this hard. Like, what could we do that's different? And then I would think, well, it's going to take, 20 years on average to get from research to clinical practice. And the research is barely just getting there. So I kind of started to think like, how do we circumvent that? Like, what other ways that what would I have needed to get what I needed faster and to get better faster? And that's kind of how Compass was created, was figuring out how we could get this information to people worldwide so that they could recover as quickly as possible and with as little, stress as possible. It's never going to be completely stress-free, but one of those things where people were getting the information support they needed, rather than being told it's psychological or it's never going to get better or it's just learn to live with it. Or just kind of that twilight zone of where people pretend like it doesn't exist, like I experienced for so much of it. So that's kind of what I do now. I do Concussion Compass full time. And like you said, I do a lot of educating on Instagram because that was the first place when I was really, really, really not feeling well. I'm like, I could do a post. I can't do a course. I can't do a talk. I can't teach, but I can do a post. And so yeah, that's been about 3 years since I got on that, a year and a half in Concussion Compass. And I think that's me in a nutshell.
That's great. I love how you explained how you still have some symptoms, but yet like you said, well, I can start with a post, and you just started where you were, and that's grown exponentially. And so I want to ask you, kind of before we get into today's official topic, what are some ways that you deal with your symptoms, and what are some strategies that you implement in your routine to help you kind of manage all of these things that you do?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good question. So it's been a little bit of a learning curve. So I would say to anyone navigating it, the first kind of thing is your mindset. Like, you just want to stay curious. Don't hold a too heavy of emotional attachment to an outcome. So what I mean by that is if you have a day where you try something, it doesn't work and you feel terrible, it's just a learning experience and you do something different. That's all it is. So I think it's just been through the years kind of learning what my body likes and what feels good for my nervous system. And when is the time to get back to life by doing kind of things. So I have my morning routine is probably the most important thing. And at bare minimum, if I'm being good, it's that I don't check my phone for an hour. I don't check phone. I don't check email. I don't do anything like reactive, so that I can just ease into the day, even if it's 30 minutes. If I'm really in a flow, I'll make sure that I add in like journaling and some movement and some breath work, but that doesn't happen every day. More important is the just don't be super reactive when you wake up. And then I think I do, a fair amount of pacing throughout the day. So I'm not pushing myself like too severely into symptoms where I'm going to get crashes. I'll take a look at my week and kind of figure out what feels sustainable and what feels good and what feels like I can end the day with a little energy to spare so that I don't burn out. And I do that. And I say no to things. I would do more than if I could, but it makes me get really clear on what's really important and what's really going to move the needle. And I kind of operate that way. And then of course I do a little bit of my own rehab and exercise and eat well and all the last lifestyle things.
I love that. Thank you for sharing some of that. I mean, that's encouraging for me as I'm trying to figure out what the best routine is for my brain. And you can hear every podcast, or you can learn from every like productivity business expert or every brain injury expert. And yet I like how you pointed out you had to figure out what worked for your nervous system and for your brain, because there are certain universal things that can probably be good for all of us, like staying off our phones for an hour. That's probably a good a good thing that I currently do not do, that I think you're going to inspire me to start doing.
Because get an alarm clock. Phone goes in like the kitchen, something like that.
I think that's important. But then, there are, you kind of have to realize like you might be able to tolerate a little bit more than others or less.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things too, like when I was getting back to work, it was new. Like I used to work in mortar clinic and now I'm all online. So the whole concept of it is all new. So it was kind of like you'd start to get a sense of what you needed to do in a day. And then there's a point where I have to do a lot of like writing and like how I want like to create the process for people in Compass. And I've learned that to do that, I can't be exhausted and it can't be like paired in with like calls and other things like that. So I have like days now where Mondays and Fridays are like creative days. So I leave like a ton of white space that I don't feel like super full of pressure. Like, how am I going to get it done? And then Tuesdays and Thursdays are like my on days where I'll do like a podcast or like clerical stuff, like all those kind of things. And I'm finding that works really well too. So for anyone listening, you can kind of get a sense too of just not only the day-to-day, but like, what do you need to do in that day? And what kind of state do you need to be in to be able to access that part of yourself or that part of your brain? And just almost reverse engineer it. Like, how do I want to feel? What does this need to look like? Okay, what do I need to be in that state? And reverse engineer it from there. And I'm finding that really, really helpful, especially with brain injury symptoms, because I have a hard time switching back and forth with like context. So that's been super helpful.
Yeah, that's great. And, people can look at somebody like you and see your posts and see what you do with Compass and think, how is she able to do all that with her brain injury? But what you're describing is you have boundaries and you have routine and boundaries and saying no.
Yes.
Saying no. I mean, that in itself could be an hour-long conversation learning how to say no. And it's one of the most important things for us as survivors. And, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should.
Mm-hmm.
Because like you said, you don't want to end the day completely drained every day. So realizing what's the most important.
Yeah. And honestly, you can make a lot of headway doing small amounts of things every day. You really can. Like the majority of what I do up until maybe the last 6 months where now I have hired help was like pretty small things in the day, but they were really, really, really intentional. And they were really meant to like move the needle. So I think it's like a blessing has been, it makes me only put my attention towards the things that actually matter for you. And so I think applies to everyone, but especially if you're someone that has limited capacity, don't shortchange the small bits that add up, because that is quite literally how I got to the point where when I started Compass and it was doing like an hour a day when I could barely function, or I would back up some content. And when I didn't feel well, I would take like a few days. Like you can do it. You can do things in small bits. You just have to be clear on what matters to you and what you want.
Through your darkest night, hope